Okay, so this video is the kind of companion to the Paul reading number 4 about virtues of critical thinking. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Paul, of course, and virtues, of course, but I'm going to add in a second philosopher to the mix, Aristotle, because he has a lot of kind of interesting things to say about virtues. So the first thing that I wanted to make sure, I don't know if there's a lot in perusal in the comments, people kind of getting sidetracked by this, but I've seen it in the past, so that's why I have a slide for it. We want to really make sure that when we're thinking about virtues, that we're, in this particular case, not thinking about morality or ethics too much. I mean, they're connected, right? Just like with the Clifford reading, he was talking about the ethics of belief, and he was obviously talking about scenarios where people were doing morally bad things, but the ship owner was doing the morally bad thing of like sending people off in a ship, but what a broken, badly maintained ship. But the bad thing that Clifford wanted to talk about was the ship owner's evil when it came to deceiving himself, right? And not really the sending people off to death in the ship, right? That was kind of a side thing. I mean, the thing he was focused on was behaving ethically towards beliefs, right? Not so much behaving ethically towards other people. And the same thing is kind of happening here with Paul. Paul's using the word virtue to kind of refer to an ethical or moral kind of behavior, but not in the general sense, in the very specific sense, just kind of like Clifford did, and talking about responsibilities and obligations that you have towards thinking well as a specific subset of behaving well. And so intellectual virtues are a small portion of the larger set of virtues, right? So ethics and morals, but generally behaving well towards others, but intellectual virtues are focused on that subset of things, behaving well towards believing, learning, paying attention to evidence, those kinds of things. All right? And so this kind of ties in to this famous Greek philosopher, which is probably one of the only philosophers whose name you know, even if you don't kind of know why he's famous. And I'm going to tell you one of the reasons why he's famous, because he came up with and advocated a particular theory of ethics that we're going to use today, that I'm going to tell you about today, that I think is useful to help understand both the Paul reading, but also the course as a whole. And so Aristotle had a really kind of unusual and weird approach to ethics that in a couple of important ways is really different from the way that most of us think about what it takes to be a good person. The first thing that Aristotle kind of thought that strikes most of us as weird is that he thought the opposite of what we do today about the source of ethical behavior and good people. Today we tend to think that goodness comes from the inside, right? That people have a good character, and it's that good character, that goodness within them, that explains their decisions, right? And that conversely, bad or evil people are bad or evil, and that's what explains their bad or evil actions. Like, you shouldn't be surprised that evil people do evil things because they're evil people. That is the key thing here, is that we generally think that you're who you are first, and that's what causes the behaviors that you commit, that you have, right? Aristotle thought 180 degrees. He thought the opposite of that. He said, we do not act rightly, that is, morally. We do not act well or poorly, evilly or goodly, right? Because we have a pre-existing virtue or excellence, because we have a moral character. But rather, we have the virtue or excellence or moral character because we have acted rightly, morally, in the past. That is, he says, he thinks that the fundamental insight about moral character and moral behavior is that we are what we repeatedly do. That is, our current character is basically an accumulated track record of the decisions that we have made in the past, that we have built our character through our decisions, not that our decisions reveal a pre-existing character. So for Aristotle, excellence is not an act, but a habit. That is, you shouldn't judge people on single decisions. Single decisions don't reveal their character. Single decisions do affect people's character, but the character is the overall track record of all the decisions that you have made up until this point. So that's one weirdness of Aristotle, but it's a pretty good one, and it works well with the other weirdness, which is on my next slide. And that is that we tend to think of ethics as happening on maybe a spectrum, right? That there's good on one end and evil on the other end, and that whenever you're confronted with some kind of moral decision, that things that particular choices are better or worse. That is, they're closer to the good end or they're closer to the evil end, right? And that being a good person means consistently choosing things on the good end of the spectrum, and being a bad person means that you are that you choose things, that your character makes you choose things on the evil end of the spectrum. And Aristotle rejected that too. Aristotle said, well, of course there are better and worse decisions, right? There are decisions that good people make and there are decisions that bad people make. But it's not a spectrum where good's on one end and evil's on the other end. It's a spectrum where good's in the middle. And there are two kinds of evil, one for each other end. He thought that virtuous behavior was the moderate thing to do, and that there were two evils, and one of the evils was doing too little of the good thing, and the other evil was doing too much of the good thing. So, as an example, in general morality, we generally think that being courageous is a good thing, right? And that you want to be courageous, you want to pick the courageous thing to do, and that's reflective of a courageous character, right? And then we generally think of bad people as being cowardly, right? That's a thing to avoid. And Aristotle agrees with that. He says that yes, it is vicious, it is a vice to be cowardly. But he also thinks that for courage, too much courage is a bad thing, and that we all know of people who are too courageous for their own good, and Aristotle has a word for that, and that word is reckless, right? Being reckless is different than being courageous. Being reckless means being foolhardy, taking risks that are not warranted given the, given the situation, right? That's a kind of a stupidity that you want to avoid for Aristotle. And he thinks that what the appropriate way to act, the appropriate way to be, is to be in the middle, to be balanced between the extremes of recklessness and cowardice. And so Aristotle thinks that for any kind of good character trait that you can identify, that you should be able to identify too much of that good thing and too little of that good thing. And he's going to combine this with that idea from the last slide, that you are what you repeatedly do, to come up with an idea about how people build, develop, and improve their moral characters. So he's going to say, people aren't born in any particular way. They're shaped by their decisions. If they're not aware of this, and they just go through life making decisions without understanding how those decisions impact their character, then kind of by accident, they could have, for various reasons, right, tended to pick cowardly choices on those decisions and built themselves a cowardly character. And Aristotle says if you kind of reflect on your character, and you can do this, you can kind of like think about what kind of person am I, you can contemplate hypothetical decisions and what would I tend to choose to do in those situations. That's going to kind of tend to reveal your character like this. And if you discover by doing a kind of a self-inventory of your ethics, your moral character. I'm pretty cowardly, right? I have tended to choose cowardly options in the past. I haven't ever done anything really courageous or let alone reckless. So I'm pretty much over here, and I don't want to be over here. I want to be more appropriately courageous, like lots of the people that I look up to in my life. They seem to, and we all have people we look up to, mentors in our life, people for whom to cope well with life's obstacles, who seem to make kind of the right decisions at the right times, right? And those people, Aristotle is going to say, make those right decisions because they've trained themselves to be capable of making those correct decisions, because they're kind of in the middle here, so they're appropriately courageous. And so he says that the thing that you need to do, if you've identified that you lack courage, that you're more towards the deficiency end of the spectrum, then what you need to do to fix yourself is you need to start engaging, taking the opportunity when decisions present themselves to you to choose not the more courageous option, but the more reckless option. That is, and this is kind of surprising and unusual, what Aristotle is saying is, if you want to reach the middle, but you're over on one side, then the right thing to do when you have the opportunity to make a decision that's going to help kind of habituate a particular character of yours, you don't want to pick a decision that reflects the middle, because you're not there yet. You want to pick a decision on the opposite side of the spectrum, because that's going to have the effect of counteracting past decisions which were over here. You want to cancel them out. You want to drag your character towards the middle, and you can't drag your character towards the middle effectively by picking decisions that are in the middle. You're going to pick decisions on the other side. So if you identify that you've been kind of a cowardly person, then you need to intentionally, when decision opportunities present themselves, pick something deliberately reckless. That is, you kind of consciously have to pick a choice that's out of character for you. And by picking choices that are out of character for you, you're going to change your character, not so that you want to stop. You don't want to pick so many opportunities. You don't want to take a ton of opportunities, and every decision you have that calls on your courage, act recklessly, because if you're not careful, you will drag yourself past the golden mean and all the way over here recklessness, and then you're in, a different but equivalent problem, right? You want to continue doing kind of a self-monitoring your character, right? And watch as you take advantage of decision opportunities that come your way to act recklessly. You're going to self-monitor and see a change in your character, says Aristotle, where you're going to feel more and more comfortable. Instead of feeling comfortable and having the natural choice be a cowardly one, the natural choice to you is going to become just a more middle-of-the-road courageous one. And that as you make those reckless decisions, and then as you get closer to the middle, you kind of dial back, and then you get towards the middle, and then it's just periodic maintenance, self-monitoring, because maybe other decisions that you didn't notice kind of dragged you one way or the other, and then you correct, you make sure that you're kind of in the middle. And we have lots of different virtues. And so sometimes if I take advantage of a particular decision, a decision point, to make a choice that's reckless because I want to drag myself away from cowardice, that decision that is reckless is also going to affect another moral virtue that I have and maybe drag it out of balance. And so then I have to continually monitor and navigate and figure out what parts of my character are most in need of work, so that the next time a decision comes along, I kind of prioritize making a decision that helps cultivate that virtue the most. And it might hurt my virtues in other areas, but then I'll follow up the next decision. Maybe that's what I'll take care of to cultivate that, to take care of that, to make sure that I'm towards the middle on that, and so on. It's a life project. People don't just kind of get themselves toward the middle and be virtuous in everything and then coast, right? It's a continuous effort of monitoring and self-improvement for Aristotle. We're going to use this because I think it's kind of an interesting perspective on what Paul says. I want to use this to talk about the intellectual virtues that Paul talks about. Because Paul, when he talks about these intellectual virtues, it's easy to interpret what he's saying as being just do more of this, do more of this, do more of this to become better, to become a better critical thinker. But I think it's kind of helpful to see each one of the virtues that Paul talks about the way that Aristotle would see them, and that it's the ideal thing that Paul wants you to get is actually not the good extreme, but it's the moderate middle between two extreme bad things. And I think this is helpful because different people have different characters, and you're going to maybe recognize in yourself that some of these intellectual virtues are things that you don't have, and that are things that you currently have too little or too much of, and you need to work your way back into the middle. So the first one that Paul talks about is intellectual humility, right? And so for this, he's talking basically about the limits of your knowledge. You need to be aware that you don't know everything and be a little bit humble about that, right? And that this is if you're not appropriately humble, then bad things are going to happen, right? And so what I would like for you to do right now, after I finish talking stuff, is maybe pause the video a bit and think about this, and then in the comments above, try and find words that you think would describe people who have too little of this consciousness of the limits of their knowledge, that aren't very aware of circumstances where their kind of natural selfishness self-deceives them, where they're not really aware of maybe their own biases and prejudices and how those impact and how narrow one's viewpoint might often be, right? What kind of word would you give to describe people who aren't aware of the limits of their knowledge? And what kind of words would you use to describe people who are maybe too aware or are too cautious about the limits of their knowledge? What kind of words would you use to describe that kind of person? Do you recognize yourself as one of those kind of people? So pause the video now and spend just a couple minutes thinking about it, and then read the comments maybe that are around here and see if you agree with other people and their words that they have used to label these two vices that are associated with this intellectual virtue. And I'm just going to wait for like 5 seconds to give space for those comments to happen in the video before I reveal the choices, the words that I think. And yours might be better. I'm actually looking forward to reading in the comments and seeing if you have better replacements for the words that I have here. But right now, I'm thinking that having too little intellectual humility, being kind of unaware of the limits of your knowledge and thinking that your limits are further out than they actually are, is characterized by the word arrogance. I think that one is kind of a natural. Too little intellectual humility is generally what we think of first, and too much. It was a little bit harder, and I'm not so happy with this, but I think it's kind of there. And that is, I think that if you are too aware of limits and you overestimate your limits, you think that your limits are narrower than they actually are, that might be, hyper wokeness. That is, you're too woke, you're too worried about the limitations of your viewpoint, you're too aware that other people have different viewpoints and that you shouldn't overexpand the scope of your viewpoint. That maybe, and I'm not super happy with that term, but I thought I'll throw it out there and see what you guys think. But maybe by looking at both intellectual humility and how it's described, and getting some kind of labels that accurately capture what having too little or too much of that virtue are, that you'll recognize yourself and be able to do kind of a self-inventory and think, well, I have to work to become more or less intellectually humble. Right now I'm too humble, or I'm not humble enough, so I need to work on that. And expressly, when the opportunity comes along, pick a decision to just shut the hell up, maybe, or not assume I'm right. If I need to work on my arrogance, right? Need to deliberately pick the humble thing to do, or vice versa, right? Get a little bit ballsy, get a little bit overconfident of myself and the scope of my viewpoint, and how it's more valid than maybe I usually tend to think, right? To counteract my my tendency to be maybe too woke, too conservative with thinking that my viewpoint is a appropriate one that gives me knowledge about particular things. All right. The second virtue that Paul talks about is intellectual courage. And this one, again, especially because I used as an example moral courage, this is easy to confuse with, but we're talking about intellectual courage here. So I'm really going to try and contrast that with, being courageous in the moral sense. So in the intellectual sense, courage means being conscious of the need, being able to face and fairly address ideas, beliefs, viewpoints that we have strong negative emotion towards. That is, intellectual courage is not about being able to confront scary situations in the broad sense. It's about having the courage to confront scary ideas. And ideas are scary if they threaten to displace other ideas, other beliefs that we already have and that we would like to hold on to, right? And so intellectual courage is talking about having the courage to hear out an idea, to fairly and rationally contemplate it, and to have the courage to accept that belief if the evidence says that belief is true, even if it means admitting that things we presently believe are false and we got to give them up. Because often giving up beliefs, replacing beliefs, changing your mind can be a scary thing. And so intellectual courage is that virtue that lets you confront those scary ideas, not confront them to reject them, but confront them to seriously consider them and have the courage to accept them if the evidence says they're more accurate than the beliefs you currently have. Have the courage to give up your old beliefs and adopt new ones if it's appropriate. So again, I'm going to pause the video so that you can kind of maybe brainstorm what you think too little courage looks like and too much. This one might be kind of easy because I kind of probably the things that I had 2 slides ago will work fine here. Let's see what I put in a couple minutes while I wait. I'm just going to wait a couple seconds for you to pause the video and put in your guesses. Let's see if I was totally unimaginative here. I was I didn't want to just use recklessness and cowardice. I think those words are fine, but here are a couple other ones that might work, right? Too little intellectual courage means that you're going to shy away from really kind of hearing out those ideas. You're going to avoid them, right? And I picked that instead of cowardice because I really did want to distinguish from the moral courage. Intellectual courage is different. And having too much intellectual courage, I think, could show up as being kind of combative, that you're going to go out there and you're going to wade out there and you're really going to attack those ideas. And if they're good, you're going to adopt them, but that you're really going to be too much, too prone to kind of seeking out opportunities to change your mind. So you're kind of going to be combative with the ideas out there, with the ideas that you currently hold, and that you're going to be too eager to have that fight with, should I change my mind now? Should I change my mind now? That kind of thing. So tell me in the comments if you think that these are appropriate, or if you think that the other things people had, or maybe just the cowardice and recklessness are better to kind of characterize the two intellectual vices that go along with intellectual courage. Okay, the third one is intellectual empathy. And again, this one maybe has a little, we got to be careful not to blur it with the moral dimension of empathy, right? Here, we're talking about the ability to put yourself in the place of other people, not to kind of sympathize with them, but to understand their point of view, their rational concerns, their belief system and how it works, things like that. right? And to be aware of your own tendency to think that the truth is just what you believe and what you see, right? And that what you traditionally think is just automatically going to be true. So whenever anybody kind of disagrees with you or have a different point of view, you don't tend to kind of pause and think, what does the world look like for that person? Do they have a point, right? Is their perspective a legitimate one that could maybe have better access to the truth than mine does? This is an opportunity to think, like, this does kind of overlap with the other beliefs. These virtues are not totally distinct, different traits that don't interact with each other, right? We talked in intellectual humility about the limits of your own knowledge and perspective, and that's kind of coming back with intellectual empathy, because here we're specifically talking about perspectives and other people's perspectives, and not the limits of your own, but your ability to understand other people's perspectives, right? So that's what intellectual empathy is all about. So what does too little intellectual empathy look like? What words would you use to describe that? And what words might you use to describe too much intellectual empathy? Because that, arguably, also possible, that you're too prone to put yourself in the place of others, to understand them. So I'm just going to wait a couple seconds for you to pause the video and add comments or read other people's comments. And then I'm going to show you the words that I thought might fit. So too little intellectual empathy is like egocentrism, or maybe narcissism, right? You're too self-centered, right? And I think that's the easy answer. Too much, I think Aristotle would say it's possible to have too much intellectual empathy, such that you are so busy putting yourself in the place of others to understand them that you forget to come home. That you forget your own perspective is also legitimate, and so you stop understanding your own perspective because you're so preoccupied with understanding other people's perspectives. All right, the fourth trait, intellectual autonomy. So this one, to learn to think for yourself, to be the author of your own beliefs, right? To question when it's rational to question. What does too little of that look like? What word would you use to describe too little intellectual autonomy? And is it possible to have too much intellectual autonomy? It kind of is, I think. So I'm going to pause a couple seconds here and then show you the words that I think characterize those two extremes. I think too little intellectual autonomy means you're kind of conformist. You're following the leader. You're not thinking independently. You're just collecting the thoughts, beliefs, viewpoints, perspectives of other people and just saying, yeah, okay, I'll pick that. You're not thinking for yourself. You're just uncritically adopting what the people around you think. But I also think that it's possible to have too much intellectual autonomy. That is, to really kind of over-concentrate on being your own person, on being an individual, so much that you reject kind of by reflex what other people think. You're too worried about appearing as a conformist that you just kind of knee-jerk deny and refuse to accept a belief if other people around you accept it. So you become a kind of a contrarian. That is, you confuse being your own person with being a different person than the other people around you, right? So that's a contrarian, is just someone who kind of automatically disagrees with other people as a way to kind of mark their independence from those other people. And being independent doesn't mean you think differently from other people. It means you can agree with everybody else. It just means you agree with them because you have figured out that that's the right way to think, and you don't agree with them just because they think that way, right? That's what intellectual autonomy means. All right, the fifth one, intellectual integrity. So this is maybe a little bit tricky to kind of understand, but it's about having standards for thinking, for standards for the level of evidence that you need to change your mind or believe something different, and to hold yourself to the same standards as other people, right? That you don't give yourself an easier time with your current set of beliefs, then and hold up other sets of beliefs to super high levels of standards so that you don't have to worry about changing your mind. So having too little intellectual integrity and having too much, what do you think those would look like? Okay, so here's the words that I think I would use. I think having too little intellectual integrity is what hypocrites demonstrate. Too little intellectual integrity. That is, hypocrites clearly have a double standard when it comes to measuring or testing their own beliefs and measuring other people's. They have super high standards of requirements, evidence, and proof for other people's belief, but they let themselves slide on those same things. That's being a hypocrite. That's having too little intellectual integrity for me. Having too much, can you have too much integrity? That sounds difficult, right? So some of these virtues you might think, no, I don't agree with the kind of the Aristotle, the two vices and the virtues in the middle. Some of these you might think really kind of do line up with the kind of the good evil, the good extremes on one end and the bad extremes on the other end, and you want to go all the way that way. But Aristotle would probably say, no, actually, I think that there is something about having too much intellectual integrity, and that is to do the opposite of being a hypocrite, which is to hold yourself to higher standards than you hold other people to. And that's bad too. You want to be fair to yourself as well. You want to hold yourself to the same standard, not to higher standards. Okay. The sixth virtue, intellectual perseverance. So the idea here is that to be a critical thinker, to increase your capacity to understand and think well about stuff, you have to be ready to struggle. That, especially with complicated or nuanced or subtle ideas or complicated issues or problems, that you need to be prepared to work at figuring it out. And that that is the route to deeper understanding or insight. So what do you think having too little perseverance should be called? What's having too much? That might be the more difficult and challenging one. So think about that for a bit. And I'll wait a couple seconds. And by this time, nobody's stopping to put comments in. You just want to see what I said, because these are like the right answers, right? They're not the right answers. I think they're good ones, but you might have better ones. Too little intellectual perseverance, giving up too quick, defeatism, right? Or learned helplessness or something like that. I think that that's a concern. People, and I see this in students, right? They're used to having a particular level of challenge or to going about their business of being a student in a particular way, and that sometimes when they're confronted with something unusual or a difficult task that maybe they haven't been prepared well for, that some students will just kind of give up too easily, and you want them to have a little bit more intellectual perseverance, because as a prof, you've seen lots of students and you're like, if you just work at this, you can figure it out, but you have to work at it. You have to have this character trait to work at it. So maybe you don't have enough. Maybe you're one of those students who doesn't have enough intellectual perseverance. You lose your confidence and you give up too easily. But on the other hand, maybe you're an overachiever, and maybe that's unhealthy. And having too much intellectual perseverance can be a bad thing too. And the word I've used to describe that is being a perfectionist. Perfectionism is overindulging in the struggle with particular questions and really losing yourself in that thinking, when, you know what, you don't need to. It's not good to overinvest energy in a particular issue. There is such a thing as overinvesting energy in a particular issue before you kind of like say, okay, I've spent a reasonable amount of energy trying to come to an understanding of this. Sometimes you have to give up and admit things are kind of outside your present capacities, and so sometimes there is a legitimate point at which you should give up, and perfectionists are just not willing to admit that, and so they'll struggle and get themselves into more trouble because they won't know when it's appropriate to give up on that thing and maybe spend time on something else. the second last virtue. Now we're done with the intellectual blank things, and we have the two kind of oddballs that aren't phrased the same way. The seventh one is confidence in reason. And so the idea here is this one's more kind of communal in that it's outwardly directed at other people, but it's still a character trait that you have, that you are prepared to kind of sit back and let other people figure it out. That you have confidence in other people's capacity to reason through things like you have and reach the same conclusion that you did. If you think that you have been a critical thinker and that you have worked to understand the situation and come to a particular point of view, a particular belief about a particular situation, and you think that is what, if you think that's what the evidence points to, right? That that you think that you impartially and perceptively looked at the evidence, and on the basis of the evidence you said the right thing to believe is this thing right here, and so you start believing that thing, that you should extend that courtesy and that confidence to other people, that if you give other people the room and the space, the time and the space to think things through, to tackle this issue, that they also will do what you did. That is, they'll go out, survey the evidence, they'll think about it, and they will eventually, if you give them enough time and space, come to the same conclusions you did and believe what you did. In other words, you have confidence in reason, so you think that you shouldn't kind of force belief on other people. That the best way to get people to think the right thing is not to indoctrinate them, but to just kind of show them the facts and trust them that they will start believing what you believe because you just gave them the facts and you said, here, this is what made me believe what I believe. You take a look at it, and that you're going to trust that their reasoning abilities will conclude from the same evidence that what you think, right? And that they'll come to understand what you think is the truth in the same way that you did. So what do you think too little confidence in reason? What kind of label would you put on that? What kind of label would you put on too much? Okay. My ideas for these is that I think that people who have too little confidence in reason are cynics about other people, right? They hold a low opinion of other people's ability to come to sensible decisions, to sensible beliefs, and so they think we can't trust other people to reason their way through this. We just need to tell them what to think, right? You can have too much confidence in reason, right? So you can have too much trust in people's ability to figure stuff out, right? Says Aristotle. That this is possible to have too much confidence in other people's ability to reason through complicated issues and come to the right decision. You might think, no, there's certain things for which people are distractible or aren't in the right position to think rationally about, so they get persuaded by emotions or fears or something like that. And so the word that I would use to describe people who are overconfident in other people's reason being able to get them to end up in the right spot are that those people are naive about human nature, about human capacity to reason. And the last one, fair-mindedness. So the idea here is you want to be fair and treat all viewpoints alike, that is, treat them with respect and deference, right? And not to privilege your own because it's yours, right? To make it the first among equals. No, everybody's viewpoint ought to be treated equally, says this particular virtue of critical thinking. So what do you think having too little of this need, this consciousness of the need to treat all viewpoints alike, and do you think it's possible to be too aware, to be too courteous of other people's viewpoints, and what kind of word would you use to describe that? Okay, here's my answers. I think that too little of being fair-minded is to be kind of tribal, that is, to really discount the value of other people's beliefs, and to overprivilege your own belief system is to basically be tribal, and that you're not going to give a fair chance to the beliefs that belong to a different viewpoint because you're overprotective of your own. But I also think that it's possible to be too fair-minded, in the same way as it was, in kind of the same way as it was possible to be too intellectually empathic, that you kind of overindulge in contemplating other people's perspectives. Here you're kind of too deferent to other people's perspectives and you deprivilege your own perspective and you put it on the back burner. There might be opportunities when that's actually fair, but if you kind of do it consistently, then you risk loss of self or loss of identity, because you're going to kind of treat your viewpoint as less worthy than other people's. So that's your whirlwind tour of those 8 intellectual virtues of Paul, seen as an ancient dead Greek guy would see them. And so kind of the project of this course, you might be able to think of in these short 3 weeks, setting you up to kind of maybe take an inventory of your current intellectual virtues, where you are right now, and to think about what maybe is most in need of work for you. Which one of these things were you more out on an edge? Were you most out on an edge? And which things do you think that at university, where you have all these intellectual resources, all of these hopefully good role models in students and professors and other people who are hopefully exemplifying intellectually virtuous people, who exemplify kind of the nice virtuous mean between the two extremes of all 8 or most of these virtues, that you could help develop your own character to be more like those role models, those intellectual role models that you find at Montclair State. Which of these 8 do you think is most in need of work, is most underdeveloped, is most vicious in you? Think about that, and this course, through this reading, but also through the other tools that I'm going to give you with the argument mapping and those other kinds of things, and learning about your psychology, might make it more within the realm of possibility for you to kind of effectively change your character and improve who you are meaningfully in one or more of these character traits. So that's my companion lecture. What's next? Well, if you're reading these things in order, then reading number 5 is next. And it's not really reading, it's a podcast. So it is compatible with you know, going out and doing yard work and going for a run and listening to it. But it also is in Perusall. So like these videos, it's just not going to have any visuals. It's just going to be an audio track, but you'll be able to plant comments in the audio track like you do for these lectures. And it's about partisanship and tribalism, so it's a psychology paper. And I thought this would be just a good time, because we're not having kind of live interactions except for if you come to office hours. This would be a good time to say, well, if this is reading number 4, and so you're kind of in the middle of week 2, you should be on your way to some extent, probably, depending on your strategy of navigating the course and what points you want earning. How are you doing with mapping? Are you happy with that? Are you unhappy with that? If you aren't satisfied with your progress in other areas of the course besides these readings and lectures, you should reach out to me. No judgment or anything like that. Maybe you kind of took a vacation for a couple days and now you're behind schedule. Get back on schedule. Tell me how I can help. Come see me during office hours and we can get you back on track if you're not sufficiently on track. Or maybe you just need some reassurance from me about where you are in the course, and that your estimations of what that's going to mean about where you end up with a grade are accurate. So you can ask me my opinion. You can say, well, I can tell you you're here right now, and at the rate that you've been accumulating points, or the rate you've been working your way through this module and that module, I think that you're going to end up with this amount of points. If things stay consistent, I can probably do that for you. Okay? So reach out to me if that's the case, and you want to have some interaction for a checkup, or that you need some help re-strategizing, retooling things because you haven't been progressing as quickly as you want to.